Okay, it's Sunday, and I don't want to read stories about politics. I don't want to read stories about war. I don't want to read stories about what's going on in the world. I just want to do something different. So I decided to go down and get some fish and chips, and I've eaten them. And now I want to talk about something that I was thinking about while I was walking down to the shops. And his name's Robert Herrick, and he's long dead. And he lived in the 17th century. And I guess, it's difficult to find ways to engage with poetry unless you're a bit of a geek like I am. Robert Herrick is not able to get on Twitter and engage with his audience. He can't write a blog, and he can't promote himself through the Chicago-based Poetry Foundation, and he can't submit stories to Wet Ink, which is an Adelaide literature magazine. He's dead, and I'm just wondering, in my mind, why Herrick appeals to me. And not many people in that era do. I mean, you've got John Milton, who was associated with the Commonwealth between the reigns of Charles I and Charles II, who wrote incredible poetry and was popular all through the 18th and 19th centuries. And you've got John Dryden, who came later and who was still writing in the 18th century, and who sort of worked to clean up the language and helped to, I guess, create a standard English. But Herrick was just a very strange beast. I guess everybody knows Shakespeare, who came the generation before Herrick, or 2 generations before Herrick, and everybody knows people like John Donne because everybody studies them in high school. The metaphysical poets. But someone who writes these pretty little poems about girls, like Herrick, he just, he disappeared pretty much for the rest of the 17th century and the 18th century, and was picked up again in the more refined environment of the 19th century. But that could have been related to the nativism that was prevalent at the time. There was a lot of pride about England and about Great Britain, and so people tended in the 19th century to look back and find their own heroes on their own soil. But this volume of Herrick that I've got, I'm just going to open it. It was it's just a really cheap edition, published in 1903. And I got it, I don't know, about 10 years ago, maybe less, maybe 8 years. And I remember I sent it to my father. This is while I was still living in Sydney. And I think he actually read some of these. And Dad was not a big literature reader. But I sent it to him because they were just so charming and pretty and delightful. 1903, when this was published, of course, was around the time in England that, a viable counterculture was starting to emerge in the wake of the progress of modernism, which sort of started about 50 years before in Paris with the publication of Baudelaire's Flowers of Evil. But what we know as a counterculture is quite a recent invention of society. So whereas someone like Virginia Woolf could earn a living out of writing novels, if you go back to an earlier generation of poets who protested against the status quo, the Romantics in the revolutionary era at the end of the 18th century, there was no way for people like that to earn a living. And if you go back to Herrick's time, of course, these poems were published in 1648. There certainly wasn't a way for poets to earn a living independent of some great man or independent of the church, unless they were writing plays. We know Shakespeare earned a good living from his association with the Globe Theatre. So Herrick was born in 1591 when Shakespeare was still writing plays, and things like Macbeth were coming out in that decade. And Herrick was born to a wealthy family. He got 2 degrees at Cambridge, and he was a follower of Ben Jonson, who was the generation after Shakespeare. Ben Jonson was alive when Shakespeare was alive, but Ben Jonson was a younger generation. And Jonson's inspiration largely came from the classics. Again, it's an elevated sphere. So young men who'd studied a bachelor's degree or a master's degree at Oxford or Cambridge would be deeply versed in the classics. So they would know the classics far better than they would know, someone like Chaucer or even Shakespeare. So Herrick belongs to the same sort of high society clique, but he still couldn't earn a living. And one of the ways that writers in those days could exist, and they had to eat and they had to have clothes, and was by taking a living at a church, and this is what Herrick did. But when the king, Charles I, declared war on Parliament, and Parliament started to gain more power, independent of the king, Herrick lost his living, and he had to go back to London. And a lot of people know that Charles I was killed in 1649. Herrick published this in 1648 from his exile from his living when he was in London, and he published about 1,000 poems in this book. So I guess I'll just read some of these poems, if I can find something that I recognize. There's so many poems in this book. So here's one to Julia. A lot of these poems are dedicated to a woman, and whether there was an actual woman or not, it's hard to know. Probably not. He never married. He died a bachelor at the incredible age in those days of 83. So anyway, permit me, Julia, now to go away, or by thy love decree me here to stay. If thou wilt say that I shall live with thee, here shall my endless tabernacle be. If not, as banished, I will live alone, there where no language ever yet was known. It's such a simple little thing, and yet it has an enormous amount of music and candor about it. Here's another one called On Himself. Lovesick I am, and must endure a desperate grief that finds no cure. Ah, me, I try, and trying prove no herbs have power to cure love. Only one sovereign salve I know, and that is death, the end of woe. So I don't know why Dad kept this book. A lot of the books that I sent him, he didn't read, but Mum told me that he actually read this. It could just be because, there's really nothing happening here that he could object to. My father was a very conservative gentleman, and he voted for the Liberal Party all his life, and he read books and magazines at home, but he didn't read literature, and he didn't have much time for it. And I think that the counterculture he found a little bit challenging to his own worldview, just in general. And the things that he associated with the counterculture were a little bit too much to tolerate, and so we never discussed literature at all, really. He read, Shakespeare, and he had Shakespeare, and he, as he got older, he used to go back to Shakespeare and the King James Bible, which were the books that his mother had read him when he was a child, when she was putting him to bed. But for him, these things were sort of beyond reproach. And when you think about it, Shakespeare was writing a long time before the notion of the counterculture, which is really an invention of modernism, that starts with modernism anyway. But, yeah. So anyway, I'll read out a couple more of these. Here's one that's called On Himself, another one called On Himself. I fear no earthly powers, but care for crowns of flowers, and love to have my beard with wine and oil besmeared. This day I'll drown all sorrow. Who knows to live tomorrow? See if I can find something else. Some of these are quite long, and I'm not going to read out the long ones. The ones that really interest me are the short ones, and there's quite a lot of them in here. Here's another one called Upon Himself. I am sieve-like and can hold nothing hot or nothing cold, but put in love and put in too jealousy, and both will through. Put in fear and hope and doubt, what comes in runs quickly out. Put in secrecies withal, whate'er enters out it shall. But if you can stop the sieve, for mine own part, I'd as lieve maids should say or virgins sing, Herrick keeps as holds nothing. Here's one called Upon Love. Love's a thing, as I do hear, ever full of pensive fear, rather than to which I'll fall. Trust me, I'll not like it all. If to love I should intend, let my hair then stand on end, and that terror likewise prove fatal to me in my love. But if horror cannot slake flames which would an entrance make, then the next thing I desire is to love and live i' the fire. They're just so lovely, really, and so elegant. And this is the classical influence through Johnson. There's something to me about the earlier generation, the generation of Shakespeare, which is somehow, I don't know, more intricate and baroque. something more ornate and flowery, but you sort of slide away from that through the turn of the century and the rule of James I into the middle of the 17th century, when there's big changes happening in learning and in science especially, and you find a sort of a more elegant, a more simple and unadorned way of writing, and that'll keep on going all the way through, really through the 18th century, until you get to the Romantics. And the Romantics go back to, or had a tremendous admiration for Shakespeare and what he achieved, and the Romantics, except for people like Byron, who also wrote in that very silvery style, the Romantics experimented with different forms and different ways of writing that had been sort of abandoned during the previous 150 years of, I guess, sterilization, when they created this very, very pure verse style. And I guess that Herrick stands right at the beginning of that, when it was still perhaps radical to write like that. But anyway, so we've got all these poems of Herrick, published in 1648 when he was living in London. He'd been kicked out of his living, which was in the country, and he was back in the city and publishing to keep himself. And eventually, of course, the Commonwealth disintegrated after Cromwell died, and Charles II came back from France to take the throne. So Herrick was given back his living eventually. But I guess, we really don't know that much about him, because he wasn't a major figure in his time. But, he's endured in a way that a lot of other poets, Dryden and Milton, at least in my mind, Dryden and Milton just don't have that much interest for me. But I find in Herrick something really refreshing and different. And so that's why I decided to make this recording.